A bargain redeemed. Paris, 1919. Elizabeth Garrison kept Major Nathaniel Blackwood's old photograph on her nightstand. She had taken it herself. But tonight, as she lay in bed, something felt off. The angle of his gaze had shifted. He was looking at her now. Chapter 1. The photograph that watched. The Parisian night hummed with a restless energy, a vibration that seemed to seep through the walls of Elizabeth Garrison's small apartment and settle in her bones. It wasn't the noise, not exactly. Paris, even in the fragile peace of 1919, was a city rebuilding itself, brick by weary brick, and the sounds of hammers and saws, of voices raised in argument and laughter, were a constant backdrop. No, this was something deeper. A tremor of unease that had taken root in her soul and refused to be dislodged. Elizabeth lay in bed, the thin cotton sheet tangled around her legs, the humid summer air clinging to her skin. Moonlight, fractured by the grimy windowpane, painted the room in shades of gray and silver. Her gaze drifted, as it always did, to the nightstand beside her bed. And there it was, the photograph. It was a simple thing, a black and white image encased in a worn leather frame. Major Nathaniel Blackwood, captured in a fleeting moment of repose. She had taken it herself, nearly 2 years ago, in a brief lull between offensives near Amiens. He had known she was photographing him. He'd been staring out across the ravaged fields, his face etched with a weariness that went bone deep. He was a handsome man, even then, his dark hair wind-tossed, his jaw firm, his eyes those eyes. They were the color of a stormy sea, capable of holding both the fiercest determination and the most profound sadness. But tonight, something was different. Elizabeth sat up, pushing the damp hair back from her forehead. She reached out and touched the cool glass of the frame, her fingers tracing the outline of Nathaniel's face. It was an illusion, of course. A trick of the moonlight, perhaps. But it felt undeniably real. The angle of his gaze, the set of his mouth that had shifted. In the photograph, he had always been looking past her, towards some distant horizon only he could see. A horizon stained with the smoke of battle, the memory of loss. But now he was looking at her. Directly at her. A shiver ran down her spine, despite the warmth of the night. It wasn't a look of accusation, or even of longing. It was searching, as if he were trying to tell her something, a message whispered across the years and the miles that separated them, a message carried on the fragile wings of a faded photograph. Elizabeth had met Nathaniel Blackwood in the chaotic spring of 1917. She was a volunteer nurse, assigned to a casualty clearing station just behind the front lines. He was a major in the British Army, brought in with a shrapnel wound to his shoulder, a wound that had miraculously missed anything vital but had left him pale and weak. She had tended to him, changing his bandages, soothing his fevered brow, listening to his whispered, pain-filled ramblings. He'd been different from the other officers. There was a quiet intensity about him, a vulnerability that he tried to hide beneath a veneer of stoic professionalism. He spoke little of the war, of the horrors he had witnessed. Instead, he asked about her life before the war, about her dreams, about the small, seemingly insignificant things that made up the fabric of a normal existence. She, in turn, had found herself drawn to him, to the unspoken sadness that haunted his eyes, to the strength that she sensed beneath his wounded exterior. They had shared stolen moments, brief conversations in the flickering candlelight of the hospital tent, whispered words over the constant drone of artillery fire. A connection had formed, fragile but real, a spark of hope in the desolate landscape of war. Then he was gone. Transferred back to his unit, back to the trenches, back to the relentless grind of battle. She had received a few letters, carefully worded missives that hinted at the horrors he was enduring but never fully revealed them. And then, silence. The war ended. The armistice was signed, and Paris slowly began to breathe again. Elizabeth stayed on, working at a hospital for recovering soldiers, helping to mend the broken bodies and shattered minds that the war had left behind. She told herself she was staying because she was needed, because her skills were valuable, because there was still so much work to be done. But the truth was she was waiting. Waiting for a letter, a word, a sign. Waiting for Nathaniel. The photograph had arrived a few months after the armistice, tucked inside a small, unassuming package. There was no note, no explanation, just the image itself. She had placed it on her nightstand, a silent sentinel, a reminder of the man who had touched her heart in the midst of chaos. Now, staring at the altered image, Elizabeth felt a knot of fear tighten in her stomach. What did it mean? Was it a sign? A warning? Or simply the product of her own weary mind, playing tricks on her in the darkness? She reached out and picked up the photograph, turning it over in her hands. The back was sealed, the paper brittle with age. She hesitated, her fingers tracing the edges of the frame. Should she open it? Was there something hidden inside, a message that had been waiting to be revealed? The decision was made for her. A sudden, sharp rap at her door shattered the silence. Elizabeth jumped, her heart pounding in her chest. Who could be calling at this hour? She slipped out of bed, pulling on a thin robe, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. She crept to the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the latch. "Who is it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. A man's voice, low and muffled, answered. "Mademoiselle Garrison? It's urgent. Please open the door." The voice was unfamiliar, but the urgency in it was undeniable. Elizabeth hesitated for a moment longer, her mind racing. Could it be connected to the photograph? To Nathaniel? She took a deep breath and unlatched the door, pulling it open just a crack. A man stood in the dimly lit hallway, his face obscured by the shadows. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a long, dark coat that concealed most of his features. "Mademoiselle Garrison," he said again, his voice slightly clearer now. "I have a message for you. From a friend." He held out a small, sealed envelope. Elizabeth reached for it, her fingers brushing against his. His hand was cold, and she felt a jolt of electricity pass between them. As she took the envelope, the man stepped back into the shadows. "Read it carefully," he said, "and be prepared. Everything is about to change." Then, he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the long, empty corridor. Elizabeth stood there, frozen, the envelope clutched in her hand, the photograph's altered image burned into her memory. The Parisian night suddenly felt colder, the hum of unease replaced by a chilling certainty. Something was terribly wrong. And she knew, with a sickening certainty, that Nathaniel Blackwood was at the heart of it. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Parisian Twilight. The envelope felt heavy in Elizabeth's hand, a lead weight pressing down on her palm. The paper was thick, expensive, the kind used for official documents or clandestine communications. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat echoing the unsettling rhythm of the city outside. She closed the door, her hand still shaking, and leaned against it, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The apartment, usually a haven of quiet solitude, now felt oppressive, the shadows seeming to press in on her. She fumbled for the light switch, her fingers clumsy and unresponsive. The sudden glare of the electric bulb made her blink, the familiar objects in the room, the worn armchair, the overflowing bookshelf, the small table with its chipped teacup seeming strangely alien, distorted by the harsh light and the sudden surge of fear. She walked over to the bed, her legs feeling weak and unsteady. The photograph of Nathaniel still lay on the nightstand, his altered gaze fixed on her, a silent, unsettling presence. She picked it up again, her fingers tracing the contours of his face. The illusion, or whatever it was, remained. He was still looking at her, that searching, almost pleading expression in his eyes. With a trembling hand, she set the photograph down and turned her attention to the envelope. Her name was written on the front in a bold, unfamiliar script. No return address, no indication of who had sent it. Just her name, a stark declaration in the midst of the swirling uncertainty. She tore open the seal, her fingers ripping through the thick paper. Inside, there was a single sheet of folded paper and a small, tarnished key. The key was old, its teeth worn and its handle engraved with an intricate design that she didn't recognize. It looked like it belonged to a lock that hadn't been opened in decades. Elizabeth unfolded the paper, her eyes scanning the handwritten message. The words were brief, cryptic, and chilling. He is in danger. They know. Go to the Rue de Rosiers, number 17. The key will open the cellar door. Trust no one. A friend.
He.
The pronoun was clear, unmistakable. It referred to Nathaniel. He was in danger. They knew. The words echoed in her mind, a terrifying refrain that sent a fresh wave of fear through her.
Who were they?
What did they know? And what danger was Nathaniel facing?
The Rue des Rosiers.
She knew the street. It was in the Marais district, a labyrinthine network of narrow alleys and ancient buildings, a place steeped in history and secrets. Number 17. A specific address, a precise location. The cellar door.
The key.
The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, forming a picture that was both terrifying and compelling. Trust no one. The final instruction was the most chilling of all. It implied a web of deceit, a conspiracy that reached far beyond the confines of her small apartment, a world of shadows and hidden agendas where nothing was as it seemed. Elizabeth reread the message several times, her mind racing, trying to make sense of it all. Who was this friend? How did they know about Nathaniel? And why had they chosen her to deliver this warning? She looked at the key again, turning it over in her hand. It felt cold and heavy, a tangible link to the unknown danger that awaited her. She had a choice to make. She could ignore the message, dismiss it as a cruel prank, a figment of her own overactive imagination. She could go back to bed, try to forget about the photograph, the envelope, the whispered warning. But she knew she wouldn't. She couldn't. The connection she had felt with Nathaniel, the bond that had formed in the crucible of war, was too strong to ignore. She had to help him. She had to find out what was happening, even if it meant risking her own safety. Elizabeth stood up, her decision made. She quickly changed out of her nightclothes, pulling on a simple dress and a sturdy pair of shoes. She grabbed her coat, a worn woolen garment that had seen her through many cold nights, and slipped the key and the letter into her pocket. She paused at the door, her hand on the doorknob. She looked back at the photograph of Nathaniel, his altered gaze still fixed on her. It was no longer just a photograph. It was a call to action, a plea for help, a silent promise of a love that had survived the ravages of war. Taking a deep breath, Elizabeth opened the door and stepped out into the Parisian twilight. The city was beginning to stir, the first rays of dawn painting the sky with streaks of pink and gold. But for Elizabeth, the night was far from over. It was just beginning. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she was walking into a world of danger, a world where trust was a luxury she could not afford, and where the line between friend and foe was blurred beyond recognition. The whispers of the city seemed to follow her, a chorus of secrets and lies, urging her forward into the unknown. Chapter 3. The Ghost of Amiens. The Rue de Rosiers was a different world at this early hour. The bustling marketplace, usually teeming with vendors and shoppers, was deserted, the stalls shuttered and silent. The narrow cobblestone street, normally vibrant with life, felt eerily empty, the only sound the echo of Elizabeth's own footsteps and the distant rumble of a passing truck. The air was thick with the scent of damp stone and stale bread, a characteristic Parisian aroma that usually comforted her, but tonight it felt heavy and oppressive, laden with a sense of foreboding. The buildings, tall and imposing, their facades scarred with the marks of time and war, seemed to lean in towards her, their darkened windows like watchful eyes, observing her every move. Elizabeth walked quickly, her head down, her coat pulled tightly around her. She kept to the shadows, avoiding the pools of light cast by the infrequent street lamps. She felt exposed, vulnerable, the feeling of being watched growing stronger with every step. She clutched the key in her pocket, its cold metal a constant reminder of the task ahead. Number 17 was an unassuming building, sandwiched between a bakery and a small, dusty bookstore. Its facade was unremarkable, the paint peeling and the shutters closed tight. There was no sign of life, no indication of what lay hidden within. Elizabeth paused in front of the building, her heart pounding in her chest. She scanned the street again, her eyes searching for any sign of movement, any hint of danger. The street remained empty, silent. She took a deep breath and approached the front door. It was locked, as she expected. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. The letter had said the key was for the cellar door. Where was it? She walked around the side of the building, her shoes crunching on the gravel path. There was a small, overgrown courtyard at the back, hidden from the street by a high brick wall. And there, nestled in the corner, almost hidden by a tangle of ivy, was a wooden door, its surface weathered and cracked. It was the cellar door. Elizabeth approached the door cautiously, her senses on high alert. She could hear the faint sound of her own breathing, the rustling of the ivy, the distant murmur of the city. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the key. It fit perfectly into the lock. She turned the key, the mechanism clicking softly in the silence. The door creaked open, revealing a dark, narrow staircase leading down into the depths of the cellar. A musty smell wafted up from below, the scent of damp earth, and something else, something indefinable, something unsettling. Elizabeth hesitated again. She had come this far, but the thought of descending into that dark, unknown space filled her with trepidation. What awaited her down there? Was Nathaniel there? Or was it a trap? She remembered the words of the letter. Trust no one. But she had to trust someone. She had to trust the friend who had sent her the message. And she had to trust her own instincts, her own intuition, the connection she felt with Nathaniel that had drawn her here. Taking another deep breath, Elizabeth stepped across the threshold and began to descend the stairs. The darkness enveloped her, the only light coming from the faint glow of the open doorway behind her. The air grew colder, damper, the musty smell intensifying. She reached the bottom of the stairs and found herself in a small, low-ceilinged cellar. The air was thick with dust, and cobwebs hung from the rafters like ghostly shrouds. The only light came from a single, flickering candle on a wooden crate in the center of the room. The candle illuminated a small, huddled figure sitting on the floor, his back against the wall. He was dressed in a tattered British Army uniform, his face pale and drawn, his eyes closed. It was Nathaniel. Elizabeth rushed towards him, her heart filled with a mixture of relief and fear. Nathaniel! She cried, her voice echoing in the small space. He stirred, his eyes fluttering open. He looked at her, his gaze unfocused, confused. Elizabeth? He whispered, his voice hoarse and weak. Is it really you? Yes, it's me, she said, kneeling beside him. What happened? Are you hurt? He tried to sit up, but winced in pain. He touched his side, his fingers coming away stained with blood. I was shot, he said, his voice barely audible. They were waiting for me. Elizabeth's eyes widened in horror. Who? Who was waiting for you? He shook his head, his eyes clouded with pain and confusion. I don't know, I don't remember, it was dark, there were so many of them, he trailed off, his voice fading into a whisper. He closed his eyes again, his breathing becoming shallow and ragged. Elizabeth felt a surge of panic. She had to get him out of here, to get him to a hospital, to safety. But how? She was alone, in a dark cellar, with a wounded man and an unknown enemy lurking somewhere outside. She looked around the cellar, her eyes searching for anything that could help her. There was nothing but a few empty crates, some old wine bottles, and a pile of dusty sacks. The only way out was back up the stairs, back into the unknown dangers of the Parisian night. Suddenly, she heard a noise. A faint scraping sound, coming from the top of the stairs. Someone was there. Elizabeth froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She held her breath, listening intently. The scraping sound came again, followed by a soft thud. Someone was coming down the stairs. She looked at Nathaniel, his eyes still closed, his breathing weak and shallow. She had to protect him. She had to get him out of here. But how? The footsteps grew closer, the sound echoing in the small cellar. Elizabeth knew she had only seconds to react. She looked around desperately, her eyes searching for a weapon, a hiding place, anything that could give them an advantage. But there was nothing. Only the flickering candle, the dusty crates, and the ghost of Amiens, a memory of a war that refused to stay buried, a war that had followed them into the fragile peace of a Parisian night. The darkness at the top of the stairs seemed to deepen, a void from which anything could emerge. Chapter 4. Scars beneath the uniform. The figure at the top of the stairs paused, silhouetted against the faint light from the open doorway. Elizabeth held her breath, every muscle tense, her eyes fixed on the shadowy form. It was a man, she could tell that much, but his features were obscured by the darkness. He was holding something in his hand, something that glinted faintly in the candlelight. A weapon? He began to descend the stairs slowly, deliberately, each step echoing in the confined space. Elizabeth felt a surge of panic, but she forced herself to remain calm. She had to think, to act quickly. She couldn't let him see Nathaniel, not yet. She quickly extinguished the candle, plunging the cellar into complete darkness. The sudden absence of light was disorienting, but it also gave her a momentary advantage. She knew the layout of the cellar, the position of the crates, the location of the stairs. He didn't. She moved silently, her bare feet making no sound on the damp stone floor. She crept behind one of the crates, pulling Nathaniel with her, his body limp and unresponsive. She pressed her hand over his mouth, stifling any sound he might make. The man reached the bottom of the stairs. She could hear him breathing, his footsteps moving cautiously across the floor. He was searching for them, she knew it.
He was hunting them.
Mademoiselle Garrison? He called out, his voice low and menacing. I know you're here.
Come out.
It's no use hiding. His voice was familiar, but she couldn't place it. It was a voice she had heard before, somewhere, sometime. But where? He moved closer, his footsteps approaching the crate where they were hiding. Elizabeth held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel Nathaniel's body trembling beside her, his breathing shallow and weak. Suddenly, the man stopped. He was right in front of the crate, so close she could smell the scent of his cologne, a faint, floral fragrance that seemed incongruous with the grim surroundings. I know you're there, he said again, his voice even lower now, almost a whisper. Don't make this harder than it has to be. He reached out, his hand brushing against the side of the crate. Elizabeth closed her eyes, bracing herself for the inevitable. He was going to find them. But then, something unexpected happened. A loud crash echoed from the street above, followed by the sound of shouting and running footsteps. The man froze, his hand still resting on the crate. What the? He muttered, his voice filled with surprise and confusion. He hesitated for a moment, then turned and ran back up the stairs, his footsteps echoing in the darkness. Elizabeth waited, her body still tense, her heart still pounding. She listened intently, trying to make sense of what was happening. The sounds from the street grew louder, more chaotic. There were more voices now, more footsteps, the sound of a struggle. Then, silence. Elizabeth waited a few moments longer, her senses on high alert. She didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe. She had to be sure it was safe. Finally, she crept out from behind the crate, her eyes adjusting to the darkness. She looked towards the stairs, the open doorway a faint rectangle of gray in the blackness. There was no one there. She rushed to Nathaniel's side, her hands trembling as she felt for his pulse. It was weak, but it was there. He was still alive. She had to get him out of here, now. Whatever had happened outside, it had given them a chance, a reprieve. She couldn't waste it. She struggled to lift him, his body heavy and unresponsive. She managed to get him to his feet, supporting his weight with her shoulder. He groaned in pain, but he didn't open his eyes. Slowly, painstakingly, she began to climb the stairs, dragging Nathaniel with her. Each step was an agony, her muscles burning, her lungs aching. But she couldn't stop. She had to keep going. She reached the top of the stairs and emerged into the courtyard. The night air was cool and fresh, a welcome relief from the stifling atmosphere of the cellar. She looked around, her eyes scanning the shadows. The street was still empty, silent. She didn't know what had happened, who had intervened, or why. But she knew one thing. She had to get Nathaniel to safety before it was too late. The scars beneath his uniform, both visible and invisible, were a testament to the battles he had fought, the horrors he had endured. And she was determined to ensure that he survived this one, too. The Parisian night held its breath, waiting to see if she would succeed. Chapter 5. A Dance Among the Ruins. Getting Nathaniel out of the courtyard and onto the street was a Herculean task. He was a large man, and even weakened, his weight was considerable. Elizabeth staggered under his bulk, her arms aching, her legs trembling with the effort. She kept whispering words of encouragement to him, though she doubted he could hear her. He remained largely unresponsive, his head lolling against her shoulder, his breathing shallow and ragged. The streets were still deserted, the early morning silence broken only by the occasional distant sound of a vehicle or a stray dog barking. Elizabeth kept to the shadows, avoiding the pools of light cast by the street lamps. She had no idea where she was going, only that she needed to get Nathaniel to a hospital, to someone who could help him. She remembered a small clinic run by a group of nuns, not far from her apartment. It wasn't a proper hospital, but it was the closest place she could think of. It was a risk, going there, exposing herself and Nathaniel to potential danger. But she had no other choice. As she struggled along the Rue Saint-Antoine, she saw a figure emerge from a side street ahead of her. It was a man, tall and slender, dressed in a dark suit. He was walking towards her, his head down, his hands in his pockets. Elizabeth's heart skipped a beat. Was it the man from the cellar? Or someone else? She couldn't take the chance. She quickly ducked into a narrow alleyway, pulling Nathaniel with her. She pressed herself against the wall, her back to the street, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The man passed by the alleyway, his footsteps echoing on the cobblestones. He didn't even glance in her direction. Elizabeth waited until he was out of sight, then slowly emerged from the alleyway, her eyes scanning the street. It was clear. She continued on her way, her pace slower now, her strength waning. She was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. The events of the past few hours had taken their toll, leaving her feeling drained and vulnerable. She finally reached the clinic, a small, unassuming building tucked away on a quiet side street. The windows were dark, but there was a faint light coming from the entrance. She approached the door cautiously, her hand resting on the bell. She hesitated for a moment, her mind filled with doubt. Was she doing the right thing? Was she putting Nathaniel in even greater danger? But she had no other choice. She had to trust the nuns, to trust their compassion, their discretion. She rang the bell, the sound echoing in the silence. She waited, her heart pounding in her chest. After a few moments, the door creaked open, and a small, elderly nun peered out at her. She was wearing a white habit, her face wrinkled and kind, her eyes filled with a gentle wisdom. "Yes?" she asked, her voice soft and soothing. I need help," Elizabeth said, her voice trembling. "This man, he's been shot. He needs a doctor." The nun looked at Nathaniel, her eyes widening slightly. She didn't ask any questions, didn't hesitate. She simply opened the door wider and gestured for Elizabeth to bring him inside. "Come in, my child," she said. "We will take care of him." Elizabeth followed the nun inside, her legs feeling weak and unsteady. The clinic was small and dimly lit, the air filled with the scent of antiseptic and incense. There were a few beds in the main room, all of them empty. The nun led Elizabeth to a small examination room at the back of the clinic. "Lay him down here," she said, pointing to a narrow cot. Elizabeth carefully lowered Nathaniel onto the cot, his body limp and unresponsive. The nun immediately began to examine him, her hands gentle and efficient. She cut away his blood-stained uniform, exposing the wound on his side. It was a nasty gash, deep and ragged. "He's lost a lot of blood," she said, her voice grave. "We need to stop the bleeding and clean the wound." She turned to Elizabeth. "You're a nurse, yes?" she asked. Elizabeth nodded. "Yes, sister." "Then you can help me," the nun said. "We need to work quickly." For the next hour, Elizabeth and the nun worked tirelessly, cleaning the wound, stitching it closed, bandaging it securely. They worked in silence, their movements coordinated and efficient. Elizabeth felt a sense of calm, a sense of purpose, that she hadn't felt since the beginning of the war. She was back in her element, doing what she was trained to do, helping to save a life. Finally, they were finished. Nathaniel was still unconscious, but his breathing was more regular, his pulse stronger. The nun looked at Elizabeth, her eyes filled with compassion.
He is stable for now, she said.
But he needs rest, and he needs to be watched carefully. She paused, then added, "You are safe here, my child. No one will find you." Elizabeth felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had found a sanctuary, a place of safety and healing. She looked at Nathaniel, his face pale but peaceful, his breathing steady and even. He was alive. And that was all that mattered. The nun led Elizabeth to a small room next to the examination room. There was a single bed, a chair, and a small table.
"You can rest here," she said.
"I will bring you some food and water." Elizabeth sank onto the bed, her body exhausted, her mind numb. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the events of the night, the fear, the danger, the uncertainty. But the image of Nathaniel, lying wounded in the cellar, kept flashing before her eyes. And the words of the letter, "Trust no one," echoed in her mind. She didn't know who to trust, who to believe. But she knew one thing, she would not leave Nathaniel's side. She would protect him, no matter the cost. She had found him again, amidst the ruins of a war-torn city, and she would not lose him again. Their dance among the ruins had just begun, and she was determined to see it through to the end, whatever that may be. A distant church bell tolled, marking the hour, but time seemed to have lost all meaning in this strange, suspended reality. Chapter 6. The Spy's Confession. Elizabeth awoke to the sound of soft chanting. Sunlight streamed through the small window of her room, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. She sat up, her body stiff and sore, her mind still groggy from sleep. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then, the events of the previous night came flooding back, the fear, the danger, the desperate race to save Nathaniel. She got out of bed and went to the door, opening it a crack. The chanting was coming from a small chapel at the end of the hallway. She could see the nuns kneeling in prayer, their voices blending in a harmonious melody. She closed the door and went back to the bed, sitting down heavily. She felt a deep sense of exhaustion, but also a sense of relief. Nathaniel was alive. He was safe for now. She heard a soft knock at the door. She stood up and opened it. The elderly nun who had helped her the previous night was standing there, holding a tray with a bowl of soup and a glass of water. "Good morning, my child," she said, her voice gentle and soothing. "I brought you something to eat." Elizabeth took the tray, her hands trembling slightly. "Thank you, sister," she said. "How is he?" "He is still sleeping," the nun said. "But his condition is stable. He is a strong man. He will recover." She paused, then added, "There is someone here to see you. He says it is urgent." Elizabeth's heart skipped a beat. Who could it be? Was it the man from the cellar? Or someone else?
"Who is it?"
she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "He says his name is Monsieur Dubois," the nun said. "He says he is a friend of Major Blackwood." Monsieur Dubois. The name was unfamiliar, but the fact that he knew Nathaniel's name was both reassuring and unsettling. "I don't know," Elizabeth said, hesitating. "I was told to trust no one." The nun nodded understandingly. "I understand your concern, my child. But this man seems genuine. He is very worried about Major Blackwood." She paused, then added, "He also says he knows who shot him." Elizabeth's eyes widened. That changed everything. If this man knew who was responsible for Nathaniel's injuries, she had to talk to him. "All right," she said. "I'll see him. But please stay with me." The nun nodded.
"Of course, my child."
She led Elizabeth to a small parlor at the front of the clinic. A man was sitting in a chair by the window, his back to the door. He was tall and slender, dressed in a dark suit. He stood up as Elizabeth and the nun entered the room. "Mademoiselle Garrison?" he asked, his voice polite and refined. Elizabeth nodded. Yes. And you are Monsieur Dubois? Indeed, he said. He turned to the nun. Thank you, sister. I appreciate your discretion. The nun nodded and left the room, closing the door behind her. Elizabeth and Monsieur Dubois were alone. Please sit down, he said, gesturing to a chair opposite him. Elizabeth sat down cautiously, her eyes fixed on him. He was a handsome man, with dark hair and piercing blue eyes. He had an air of authority about him, a sense of confidence that was both reassuring and unsettling. I understand you are a friend of Major Blackwood, Elizabeth said. Yes, he said. We have worked together on several occasions. He paused, then added, I also know who shot him.
And why?
Elizabeth leaned forward, her heart pounding in her chest. Who? She asked. Monsieur Dubois took a deep breath. It was a man named Moreau, he said. He is a double agent. He works for the French, but he is also secretly working for the Germans. Elizabeth's eyes widened in shock. A double agent? It was like something out of a spy novel, a world of intrigue and betrayal that she had only glimpsed from afar. But why would he shoot Nathaniel? She asked. Because Nathaniel discovered his treachery, Monsieur Dubois said. He had evidence, proof of Moreau's double dealings. Moreau knew he was about to be exposed, so he tried to silence him. He paused, then added, Moreau is a dangerous man, Mademoiselle Garrison. He has powerful connections. He will stop at nothing to protect himself. Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine. She had stumbled into a world far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. A world of spies, double agents, and political intrigue, where the lines between friend and foe were blurred beyond recognition. What should we do? She asked, her voice trembling. We need to get Nathaniel out of Paris, Monsieur Dubois said. He is not safe here. Moreau will be looking for him. He paused, then added, I have a plan. But it is risky. And I need your help. Elizabeth looked at him, her mind racing. She didn't know this man, didn't know if she could trust him. But she had no other choice. She had to protect Nathaniel. She had to get him to safety. The confession hung in the air, thick and heavy, a revelation that changed everything. The quiet sanctuary of the clinic suddenly felt precarious, the walls thin and fragile against the storm that was brewing outside. Chapter 7. Letters from a Lost Battalion. Monsieur Dubois' plan was audacious, bordering on reckless. It involved smuggling Nathaniel out of Paris disguised as a wounded veteran being transferred to a convalescent home in the countryside. The risks were enormous. Discovery meant certain death, not just for Nathaniel, but for Elizabeth and Dubois as well. Yet there seemed to be no other viable option. Moreau's reach was long, and his ruthlessness was well known within the shadowy circles Dubois inhabited. We'll use the old railway line, Dubois explained, spreading a worn map across the small table in the parlor. It's been abandoned since the war, mostly used by smugglers and those who prefer to travel unseen. He traced a finger along a faint, broken line that snaked its way out of Paris, heading south towards the Loire Valley. There's a small village, St. Remy-sur-Creuse, where I have contacts. They can arrange for safe passage across the border into Switzerland. Elizabeth studied the map, her mind struggling to grasp the enormity of the task ahead. But how will we get him to the railway line? He's still unconscious, and the clinic is surely being watched. Dubois smiled, a thin, humorless expression. That's where the nuns come in. They have a network. They help those in need, regardless of their allegiance. They've agreed to transport Nathaniel in their ambulance, under the guise of a routine transfer to another clinic. It's a risk, but they are willing to take it. The nuns. Elizabeth had underestimated them. Beneath their quiet piety and gentle demeanor lay a fierce determination and a network of resistance that had survived the war, hidden in plain sight. And what about me? Elizabeth asked. What is my role? You will accompany Nathaniel, Dubois said. You will be his nurse, his caretaker. You will ensure he remains safe and hidden. You will also be my eyes and ears. I need you to be alert, to watch for any sign of Moreau's men. He paused, his gaze intense. This is not a game, Mademoiselle Garrison. This is real. Lives are at stake. Are you sure you're prepared for this? Elizabeth met his gaze, her own unwavering. She had come this far. She had faced death and danger before, in the trenches of the Western Front.
She would not falter now.
I am, she said, her voice firm. I will do whatever it takes to protect Nathaniel. Du Bois nodded, seemingly satisfied.
Good.
We leave at dusk. Be ready. The hours that followed were a blur of activity. Elizabeth spent the time tending to Nathaniel, changing his bandages, monitoring his vital signs. He remained unconscious, but his condition seemed to be improving. He was still pale and weak, but his breathing was stronger, his pulse more regular. As dusk approached, Elizabeth changed into a simple nurse's uniform, provided by the nuns. It was a stark reminder of her past, of the long, grueling hours she had spent caring for wounded soldiers in the makeshift hospitals behind the front lines. But this was different. This was personal. This was about saving the man she loved. The nuns, true to their word, had arranged for the ambulance. It was an old, battered vehicle, its engine sputtering and coughing. But it was functional, and it was discreet. Nathaniel was carefully loaded onto a stretcher and placed in the back of the ambulance. Elizabeth climbed in beside him, her heart pounding in her chest. Du Bois stood outside, his face grim.
Be careful, he said.
And trust no one, except the nuns. They are your only allies. He handed Elizabeth a small, sealed envelope. This contains letters of introduction to my contacts in St. Remy-sur-Creuse. They will help you get to Switzerland. Elizabeth took the envelope, her fingers trembling slightly. Thank you, she said. For everything. Du Bois nodded.
Go now.
And may God be with you. The ambulance pulled away from the clinic, its headlights cutting through the gathering darkness. Elizabeth looked back, watching as Du Bois disappeared from view. She was alone now, with Nathaniel, heading into the unknown. As they drove through the darkened streets of Paris, Elizabeth opened the envelope Du Bois had given her. Inside, there were several letters, addressed to various individuals in St. Remy-sur-Creuse. But there was also another letter, a smaller one, addressed to her. She unfolded the letter and began to read. It was from Nathaniel. My dearest Elizabeth, it began. If you are reading this, it means I have failed. I have been captured, or worse. I do not know what the future holds, but I want you to know that you are the best thing that ever happened to me. You brought light into my darkness, hope into my despair. You showed me that love could exist, even in the midst of war. I may not have much time left, but I want you to know that I love you. I always have and I always will. Nathaniel, tears streamed down Elizabeth's face as she read the words. It was a letter from a lost battalion, a message from a man who had faced death and found love in the most unlikely of places. It was a testament to their connection, a bond that had survived the horrors of war and the dangers of the present. She clutched the letter to her chest, her heart aching with a mixture of love and grief. She would not let his sacrifice be in vain. She would get him to safety. She would fulfill his wish, his hope for a future that might never be. The ambulance rumbled on, carrying its precious cargo towards an uncertain destiny, the letters a silent promise of a love that defied the odds. Chapter 8. The Nightingale's Secret. The journey to St. Remy-sur-Creuse was a harrowing ordeal. The old ambulance, battered and unreliable, rattled along the poorly maintained roads, each jolt sending a wave of pain through Nathaniel's injured body. Elizabeth did her best to keep him comfortable, administering morphine when the pain became unbearable, constantly monitoring his vital signs. The countryside, shrouded in darkness, felt alien and menacing. Every passing vehicle, every distant sound, sent a jolt of fear through Elizabeth. She knew they were being hunted, that Moreau's men were searching for them. She had to remain vigilant, to trust her instincts. They stopped several times along the way, at pre-arranged locations known only to the nuns. Each time, a different nun would meet them, providing fresh supplies, checking on Nathaniel's condition, offering words of encouragement. These women, these silent guardians, were their lifeline, their only connection to the outside world. During one of these stops, in a secluded farmhouse hidden deep in the forest, Elizabeth met Sister Marie Claire, a young nun with a surprisingly steely gaze. She was different from the other nuns, more outspoken, more worldly. "You are brave, Mademoiselle Garrison," Sister Marie Claire said, as she helped Elizabeth change Nathaniel's bandages. "To risk your life for a man you barely know." Elizabeth looked at her, surprised. "I know him," she said. We met during the war. We formed a connection, a bond that she trailed off, unable to find the words to describe the complex emotions that bound her to Nathaniel. Sister Marie Claire nodded understandingly. "Love can blossom in the most unexpected places," she said, "even in the midst of war." She paused, then added, "I have a secret to tell you, Mademoiselle Garrison. A secret that may help you on your journey." Elizabeth looked at her, intrigued. "What is it?" Sister Marie Claire leaned closer, her voice barely a whisper. "There is a network of women," she said. "Women who helped soldiers escape during the war. They call themselves the Nightingales. They are still active, still helping those in need." The Nightingales. Elizabeth had heard whispers of this legendary group, but she had always dismissed them as rumors, as wartime folklore. How can I find them?" Elizabeth asked. "They are everywhere," Sister Marie Claire said. "And nowhere. You must look for the signs. A single white feather, placed in a window. A songbird, carved into a tree. A whispered phrase, passed from one woman to another." She paused, then added, "They will know you. They will recognize the desperation in your eyes, the love in your heart. They will help you." Sister Marie Claire's words gave Elizabeth a renewed sense of hope. She was not alone. There were others, women like her, who were willing to risk everything to help those in need. They continued their journey, reaching St. Remy-sur-Creuse in the early hours of the morning. The village was small and quiet, nestled in a valley surrounded by rolling hills. It seemed peaceful, idyllic, a world away from the dangers of Paris. But Elizabeth knew that danger still lurked, that morose men could be anywhere. She had to be careful, to trust no one but the contacts Du Bois had provided. Following Du Bois' instructions, they found the safe house, a small, unassuming cottage on the outskirts of the village. An elderly couple, Monsieur and Madame Du Bois, no relation to her contact in Paris, she was assured, greeted them with cautious warmth. They were expecting them, having received word from Du Bois via the nuns' network. Nathaniel was carefully moved to a small room at the back of the cottage, where he could rest and recover. Elizabeth tended to him, her hands gentle and practiced. He was still unconscious, but his condition seemed to be stabilizing. Madame Du Bois, a kind, motherly woman, brought Elizabeth some food and water. "You must be exhausted, my dear," she said. "Rest. We will watch over him." Elizabeth was reluctant to leave Nathaniel's side, but she knew she needed to rest. She was physically and emotionally drained, and she needed to be strong for him. She went to a small room next to Nathaniel's, where a narrow bed had been prepared for her. She lay down, her body aching, her mind racing. She thought of Sister Marie Claire's words, of the Nightingales, of the secret network of women who were still fighting for freedom, for justice, for love. She looked out the window, at the small garden behind the cottage. And there, nestled among the flowers, she saw it. A single white feather, placed carefully on a windowsill.
A sign.
A message. The Nightingales were here. Elizabeth felt a surge of hope, a renewed sense of determination. She was not alone. She had allies, hidden in plain sight, waiting to help her. She closed her eyes, a faint smile playing on her lips. She would find them. She would seek their help. And together, they would get Nathaniel to safety. The Nightingale's secret was a beacon in the darkness, a promise of assistance in a world still clinging to the shadows of war. It was enough to keep her going, to keep her fighting. Chapter 9. Betrayal at the Gare du Nord. Finding the Nightingales proved more challenging than Elizabeth anticipated. The white feather was a starting point, a whisper of hope, but it didn't lead her directly to the network. She spent the next few days discreetly inquiring, observing, searching for any sign, any clue that would connect her to these elusive women. She helped Madame Du Bois with the household chores, tending the garden, preparing meals, always keeping an eye out and ear open. She visited the local market, mingling with the villagers, listening to their conversations, watching their interactions. She learned the rhythms of the village, the comings and goings of its inhabitants, the subtle nuances of their lives. She also continued to care for Nathaniel, who slowly began to regain consciousness. He was weak and disoriented, his memory fragmented and unreliable. He remembered the shooting, the cellar, Elizabeth's presence, but the details were hazy, shrouded in a fog of pain and trauma. Where are we?" he asked one afternoon, his voice hoarse and weak. "We're safe, Nathaniel," Elizabeth said, soothing his brow. "We're in a small village, far from Paris. We're being looked after." He looked at her, his eyes filled with confusion and gratitude. You saved me," he said.
"Why?"
Elizabeth hesitated, unsure how to answer. She couldn't tell him the whole truth, not yet. He wasn't strong enough. Because I care about you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. He smiled, a faint, weak smile. "I care about you too, Elizabeth," he said. "More than you know." Their conversations were brief, fragmented, punctuated by long periods of silence. But they were enough to rekindle the connection they had formed during the war, the bond that had drawn them together in the midst of chaos and despair. One evening, as Elizabeth was returning from the market, she noticed a woman standing near the village fountain. She was wearing a simple dress, her hair covered with a scarf. But there was something about her, something in her posture, in her gaze, that caught Elizabeth's attention. She saw it then. A small, silver brooch, pinned to the woman's scarf. It was shaped like a songbird, its wings outstretched in flight.
A sign.
The nightingales. Elizabeth approached the woman cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. "Excuse me," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I saw your brooch. It's beautiful." The woman looked at her, her eyes searching, assessing. She didn't say anything, just waited. Elizabeth took a deep breath. I need help," she said. "I'm looking for the nightingales." The woman's expression didn't change, but her eyes flickered slightly. She glanced around, making sure they were not being observed. "What makes you think they exist?" she asked, her voice low and guarded. Elizabeth reached into her pocket and pulled out the letter Nathaniel had written to her, the letter she had found in the ambulance. She handed it to the woman. "This is from the man I'm trying to protect," she said. "He's in danger. He needs to get to Switzerland." The woman read the letter, her eyes widening slightly. She looked at Elizabeth again, her gaze more intense now. "Come with me," she said. She led Elizabeth to a small, unassuming house on the edge of the village. Inside, there were several women gathered around a table, talking in hushed tones. They looked up as Elizabeth and the woman entered the room. "This is Mademoiselle Garrison," the woman said. "She needs our help." The women looked at Elizabeth, their eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. They were a diverse group of different ages and backgrounds. But they all shared a common trait, a fierce determination, a quiet strength that radiated from within. Elizabeth told them her story, about Nathaniel, about Moreau, about the escape from Paris, about the journey to St. Remy-sur-Creuse. She spoke honestly, openly, holding nothing back. The women listened intently, their faces grim. When she was finished, one of them, a tall, imposing woman with silver hair, spoke. "We know of Moreau," she said. "He is a dangerous man. We will help you." Elizabeth felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had found them, the nightingales. They were real, and they were willing to help. The women quickly devised a plan. They would arrange for Nathaniel and Elizabeth to be smuggled across the border into Switzerland, using a network of contacts and safe houses that had been established during the war. "It won't be easy," the silver-haired woman said. "But we have done this before. We know the risks. We know the way." The plan involved a daring train journey, back to Paris, and then on to Switzerland. It was a risky maneuver, returning to the very city they had so desperately fled. But it was the most direct route, and the Nightingales had contacts at the Gare du Nord, the main railway station in Paris. The silver-haired woman, whose name was Genevieve, gave very strict instructions. There can be no mistakes. There must be constant vigilance. However, as they prepared for departure from Saint-Rémy-sur-Creuse, a shocking betrayal unfolded. Madame Dubois, who had seemed so kind and helpful, was revealed as one of Moreau's spies. She had been reporting their movements all along. It was Monsieur Dubois who discovered the truth, finding a hidden radio transmitter in the cottage. He confronted his wife, his face a mask of shock and grief. A struggle ensued, and in the chaos, Madame Dubois was accidentally killed. Elizabeth and Nathaniel, alerted by the commotion, found Monsieur Dubois standing over his wife's body, his hands trembling, his eyes filled with tears. I didn't mean to, he stammered. She was working for Moreau. Elizabeth was stunned, heartbroken. She had trusted Madame Dubois, had confided in her. It was a brutal reminder of the dangers they faced, of the pervasive reach of Moreau's network. It cast a dark shadow of the Nightingales' plan and the imminent peril of their return to Paris. Chapter 10. Echoes of the Somme. The revelation of Madame Dubois' betrayal sent shockwaves through the small group. The safe haven had become a trap, their carefully laid plans compromised. Monsieur Dubois, shattered by his wife's treachery and her accidental death, was a broken man. Elizabeth felt a surge of pity for him, but she knew they couldn't afford to dwell on the tragedy. They had to leave immediately. Genevieve, ever pragmatic, took charge. We have no time to mourn, she said, her voice firm. Moreau knows where we are. He will be coming for us. She quickly revised the plan. The train journey to Paris was still the most viable option, but they would have to bypass the Gare du Nord. Their contact there, a railway worker named Jean-Luc, could no longer be trusted. He might be under Moreau's control, or worse, another double agent. We'll use a smaller station outside the city, Genevieve said. From there, we'll make our way to the Swiss border, by other means. It will be more difficult, more dangerous, but it's our only chance. They left Saint-Rémy-sur-Creuse under the cover of darkness, abandoning the cottage, leaving behind the shattered remnants of their hopes for a peaceful refuge. Nathaniel, still weak but conscious, was bundled into a borrowed car, driven by one of the Nightingales, a young woman named Camille. Elizabeth sat beside him, holding his hand, offering words of encouragement. The journey was tense and fraught with peril. They avoided the main roads, sticking to back alleys and country lanes. They could feel Moreau's presence everywhere, in every passing vehicle, in every shadow, in every whispered word. As they neared Paris, Nathaniel began to have flashbacks, vivid, terrifying memories of his time in the trenches. He relived the horrors of the Somme, the deafening artillery barrages, the screams of the dying, the stench of death and decay. Make it stop, he cried, his body shaking, his eyes wide with terror. Make it stop. Elizabeth held him close, trying to calm him, to soothe his shattered mind. She whispered words of comfort, of love, of hope. She reminded him that he was safe now, that the war was over, that they were together.
It's all right, Nathaniel, she said.
It's all right. You're safe. I'm here. Slowly, gradually, his tremor subsided. His breathing became more regular. He looked at her, his eyes filled with gratitude and love. Thank you, Elizabeth, he whispered. You saved me again. The echoes of the Somme, the ghosts of his past, continued to haunt him, but Elizabeth's presence was a beacon of hope, a guiding light in the darkness. They reached the small, deserted railway station outside Paris just before dawn. Camille, the young Nightingale driver, wished them luck and sped away, disappearing into the morning mist. Elizabeth and Nathaniel were alone again, waiting for the next stage of their perilous journey. The station was a relic of a bygone era, its platforms overgrown with weeds, its waiting room filled with cobwebs and dust. It felt like a ghost town, a forgotten corner of the world. As they waited, Elizabeth noticed a figure standing in the shadows at the far end of the platform. It was a man, tall and slender, dressed in a dark coat. He was watching them, his gaze intense, unwavering. Elizabeth's heart skipped a beat. Was it Morrow? Or one of his men? She couldn't be sure. She nudged Nathaniel, alerting him to the man's presence. He followed her gaze, his eyes narrowing. "I don't like this," he whispered. "Something's not right." They waited, tense and alert, their senses on high alert. The man didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, watching them, a silent, menacing presence. Suddenly, a train whistle echoed in the distance, the sound growing louder as the train approached the station. It was their train, the train that would take them to Switzerland, to freedom. But as the train pulled into the station, the man in the shadows began to walk towards them, his hand reaching inside his coat. Elizabeth knew, with a sickening certainty, that this was it. The confrontation they had been dreading. The final showdown. She stood protectively in front of Nathaniel, her body shielding his. She was unarmed, defenseless, but she was determined to protect him, no matter the cost. The man stopped a few feet away from them, his face still obscured by the shadows. He pulled his hand out of his coat, revealing not a weapon, but a small, silver brooch. A songbird, its wings outstretched in flight. The nightingales. Relief washed over Elizabeth, so intense it almost buckled her knees. But the lingering echoes of the psalm and the ever-present threat of Morrow reminded her that the journey was far from over. The train screeched to a halt, a temporary reprieve, but the true test was yet to come. Chapter 11. The Price of Honor. The man, introducing himself as Henri, was indeed a nightingale, sent by Genevieve as a backup after the disastrous events in Saint-Rémy-sur-Creuse. His presence was a much-needed reassurance, but the tension remained thick in the air. The train journey was fraught with anxiety, every stop, every inspection, a potential threat. Henri, a seasoned operative, had secured a private compartment for them, a small sanctuary in the midst of the crowded, bustling train. He explained the revised plan. They would disembark before the Swiss border, at a small, inconspicuous station near the town of Bellegarde. From there, they would cross the border on foot, guided by another Nightingale contact, a mountain guide named Jean-Pierre. Nathaniel, still recovering from his physical and emotional wounds, remained mostly silent, his gaze fixed on the passing landscape. Elizabeth stayed by his side, offering comfort and support, her own fears masked by a facade of calm determination. As they neared Bellegarde, Henri revealed a troubling piece of information. He had received word, through the Nightingale network, that Morrow had anticipated their move. He had placed agents at the border, specifically targeting trains arriving from Paris. "He knows we're coming," Henri said, his voice grim. "He's tightening the net." Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine. Morrow was relentless, his pursuit driven by a ruthless determination to silence Nathaniel and bury the truth about his treachery. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Henri looked at Nathaniel, his gaze filled with a mixture of concern and something else. Something Elizabeth couldn't quite decipher.
"There's only one way," he said.
"We need to create a diversion. Something that will draw Morrow's attention away from the border crossing." He paused, then added, "Nathaniel, you need to surrender yourself." Elizabeth gasped.
"What? No."
"That's insane." Nathaniel, however, remained calm. He looked at Henri, his eyes steady. "Explain," he said. Henri outlined his plan. Nathaniel would make a public appearance at the Bellegarde station, drawing Morrow's agents to him. This would create a window of opportunity for Elizabeth and Henri to slip across the border unnoticed, with Jean-Pierre's help. "It's the only way to ensure Elizabeth's safety," Henri said. "Morrow is primarily interested in you, Nathaniel. He wants to silence you permanently. If you give yourself up, he'll focus all his resources on you, leaving Elizabeth free to escape." It was a suicide mission, a desperate gamble. Nathaniel would be sacrificing himself to save Elizabeth. Elizabeth vehemently protested. "I won't let you do this, Nathaniel. There has to be another way." Nathaniel took her hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "There isn't, Elizabeth," he said. "This is the price of honor. The price of exposing Morrow's treachery." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a love that transcended the dangers they faced, a love that had blossomed in the midst of war and survived the ravages of time. "I did what I had to do during the war," he said. "I exposed Moreau's treason, and I'm prepared for any cost. I won't let him win. And I won't let him harm you." His words were resolute, his decision final. Elizabeth knew she couldn't change his mind. She could only accept his sacrifice, his selfless act of love. Tears streamed down her face as she embraced him, her body shaking with grief and despair. "I love you, Nathaniel," she whispered. "I always will." "And I love you, Elizabeth," he said. "Never forget that." The train pulled into the Bellegarde station. Nathaniel, accompanied by Henri, stepped onto the platform, deliberately making themselves visible. Elizabeth watched from the compartment window, her heart breaking, as Moreau's agents, alerted to their presence, closed in. It was a scene of chaos and confusion, a carefully orchestrated distraction. Nathaniel, despite his weakened condition, put up a brave fight, resisting arrest, drawing the agents further away from the train. As the struggle unfolded, Elizabeth slipped out of the compartment and made her way to the designated meeting point, where Jean-Pierre, the mountain guide, was waiting. He was a rugged, weathered man, his eyes filled with a quiet determination. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice low and gruff. Elizabeth nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "Yes," she said. "Let's go." They left the station, disappearing into the shadows, heading towards the border, towards freedom. Elizabeth looked back one last time, at the chaotic scene on the platform, at Nathaniel, fighting bravely against overwhelming odds. She knew she might never see him again. But the price of his honor ensured that his sacrifice was a testament to his love for her, and it was a love she would carry with her always, no matter what the future held. The mountains loomed ahead, a daunting obstacle, but also a symbol of hope. Chapter 12. A Promise in the Rain. The trek across the mountains was arduous, the terrain treacherous and unforgiving. Jean-Pierre, a man of few words but unwavering resolve, led Elizabeth through hidden paths and narrow trails, avoiding the main roads and border patrols. The weather was harsh, a relentless downpour turning the ground to mud, the wind whipping through the peaks, chilling them to the bone. Elizabeth, exhausted and emotionally drained, struggled to keep up. She was driven by a desperate hope, a fierce determination to reach safety, to honor Nathaniel's sacrifice. She clung to the memory of his love, his bravery, his unwavering commitment to justice. They walked for hours, mostly in silence, the only sounds the rhythm of their footsteps, the howling wind, and the constant drumming of the rain. Jean-Pierre, ever vigilant, scanned the surroundings, his eyes alert for any sign of danger. As night fell, they reached a small, abandoned shepherd's hut, high in the mountains. It was a crude shelter, little more than 4 walls and a leaky roof, but it offered some protection from the elements. Jean-Pierre built a small fire, using some dry wood he had gathered along the way. The warmth was welcome, thawing their frozen limbs, providing a small measure of comfort. Elizabeth sat by the fire, her body aching, her mind racing. She thought of Nathaniel, of his capture, of the uncertain fate that awaited him. She wondered if he was still alive, if he was suffering, if she would ever see him again. "He is a brave man," Jean-Pierre said, breaking the silence. "You're Major Blackwood." Elizabeth looked at him, surprised. "You know about him?" Jean-Pierre nodded. "The nightingales speak of him. He is a hero to many." He paused, then added, "He exposed a traitor. A man who betrayed his country, his people." Elizabeth felt a surge of pride, mingled with grief. Nathaniel's actions, his unwavering commitment to truth and justice, had resonated far beyond the confines of their own personal struggle. "He did what he had to do," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Jean-Pierre nodded again. "And you, Mademoiselle Garrison," he said, "you are also brave. To risk your life for him, to follow him into danger." Elizabeth looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. "I love him," she said. "I would do anything for him." Jean-Pierre smiled, a faint, fleeting smile. Love is a powerful force, he said. It can make us do extraordinary things. They spent the night in the hut, huddled together for warmth, sharing their meager supplies of food and water. Elizabeth slept fitfully, her dreams haunted by images of Nathaniel, of Moreau, of the treacherous journey they had undertaken. As dawn broke, the rain finally stopped. The clouds parted, revealing a breathtaking view of the surrounding mountains, their peaks covered in a fresh layer of snow. The air was crisp and clean, the world washed anew. Jean-Pierre pointed towards a distant valley, barely visible in the morning mist.
Switzerland, he said.
We're almost there. Elizabeth felt a surge of hope, mingled with a profound sense of relief. They had made it. They had survived. They continued their descent, the terrain becoming less treacherous, the path easier to navigate. As they neared the valley, Jean-Pierre stopped. "This is where I leave you," he said.
"You are safe now.
Follow the path, and you will reach the village of Les Diablerets. There, you will find sanctuary." Elizabeth thanked him, her voice choked with emotion.
"You saved our lives," she said.
"I will never forget you." Jean-Pierre smiled.
"Go now," he said.
"And may God be with you." He turned and walked away, disappearing back into the mountains, his figure blending seamlessly with the rugged landscape. Elizabeth continued on alone, her heart filled with a mixture of hope and trepidation. She had reached Switzerland, she was safe from Moreau, but she was also alone, without Nathaniel, without any certainty about his fate. As she walked, she made a promise to Nathaniel, to herself, to the world. She would not rest until she knew what had happened to him. She would find a way to help him, to free him, to bring him to safety. She would continue to fight, to resist, to expose the truth. She would honor his sacrifice, his love, his unwavering commitment to justice. She would keep his memory alive until the day they were reunited, if that day ever came. She reached the village of Les Diablerets as the sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the snow-capped peaks. It was a scene of breathtaking beauty, a stark contrast to the horrors she had witnessed, the dangers she had faced. But beneath the beauty, the promise remained, etched in her heart, a driving force that would guide her through the uncertain days ahead. The rain-washed landscape was a testament to resilience, a symbol of hope emerging from the storm. Chapter 13. The Widow's Veil. Les Diablerets was a haven, a sanctuary of peace and tranquility nestled in the heart of the Swiss Alps. The villagers, kind and welcoming, took Elizabeth in, providing her with food, shelter, and a sense of community. She found refuge in a small, cozy chalet, owned by a widowed woman named Madame Dubois, a cruel irony, given the previous betrayal, who had lost her husband in the war. Madame Dubois was a quiet, reserved woman, her face etched with a sadness that mirrored Elizabeth's own. She didn't ask many questions, didn't pry into Elizabeth's past. She simply offered her hospitality, her support, her understanding. Elizabeth spent her days helping Madame Dubois with her chores, tending the garden, caring for her small flock of chickens, trying to find some solace in the simple rhythms of village life. But her mind was constantly racing, her thoughts consumed by Nathaniel, by his uncertain fate, by the burning desire to find him, to help him. She wrote letters to everyone she could think of, to the British Embassy in Bern, to the Red Cross, to any organization that might have information about Nathaniel's whereabouts, his condition. She received no replies. It was as if he had vanished into thin air, swallowed up by the chaos of the post-war world. Weeks turned into months. The seasons changed. The snow melted, revealing lush green meadows, carpeted with wildflowers. The air was filled with the sound of cowbells, the chirping of birds, the gentle murmur of the mountain streams. Elizabeth tried to find some peace in the beauty of her surroundings, but her heart remained heavy, her spirit burdened by the weight of her loss, her uncertainty. She felt like a ghost, drifting through life, disconnected from the world around her. One afternoon, as she was walking through the village, she saw a familiar figure standing near the church. It was Genevieve, the silver-haired Nightingale leader who had helped them escape from Saint-Rémy-sur-Creuse. Elizabeth's heart leaped with a mixture of hope and apprehension. What was Genevieve doing here? Had she come with news of Nathaniel? She approached her cautiously, her voice trembling slightly. Genevieve? Is that you? Genevieve turned, her eyes widening in surprise. Elizabeth? What are you doing here? Elizabeth explained her situation, her escape to Switzerland, her fruitless search for Nathaniel. Genevieve listened intently, her face grim. I have news, she said when Elizabeth had finished. But it is not good. Elizabeth's heart sank. She had been bracing herself for the worst, but hearing the words still sent a shockwave through her. What is it? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Genevieve took a deep breath. Nathaniel was captured by Moreau's men, she said. He was taken back to Paris. He was tried for treason. Elizabeth gasped. Treason? But he was the one who exposed Moreau's treachery. Genevieve nodded. Moreau twisted the truth, she said. He used his influence, his connections, to paint Nathaniel as the traitor, himself as the loyal servant of France. She paused, then added, Nathaniel was found guilty. He was executed. The words hit Elizabeth like a physical blow, knocking the wind out of her. She staggered, her legs giving way beneath her. She felt a searing pain in her chest, as if her heart had been ripped from her body. No, she whispered, her voice choked with grief. No, it can't be true. Genevieve put a comforting hand on her arm. I'm so sorry, Elizabeth, she said. I wish I had better news. Elizabeth collapsed onto a nearby bench, her body shaking with sobs. Her world had shattered, her hopes extinguished, her love lost forever. She felt a profound sense of emptiness, a void that could never be filled. Genevieve sat beside her, offering silent support, her own eyes filled with sadness. She knew the pain of loss, the burden of grief. She had seen too much death, too much suffering during the war and its aftermath. What will I do now? Elizabeth asked, her voice broken, her spirit crushed. You will live, Genevieve said, her voice firm. You will honor his memory. You will continue to fight for justice, for truth, for the ideals he believed in. She paused, then added, You are a nightingale now, Elizabeth. You are one of us. We will help you. We will support you. You are not alone. Elizabeth looked at her, her eyes filled with tears. She had lost Nathaniel, but she had gained a new family, a new purpose. She would wear the widow's veil, the mantle of grief, but she would also wear the nightingale's wings, the symbol of resistance, of hope, of unwavering determination. She would carry on Nathaniel's fight. His execution, though a devastating blow, would not be the end. It would be a new beginning. Chapter 14. The General's Daughter. Elizabeth, though shrouded in grief, found a new resolve within the Nightingale network. Genevieve, true to her word, provided not just emotional support but also a path forward. The Nightingales, it turned out, were not merely a wartime resistance group, they were a deeply embedded network dedicated to justice and truth, extending their reach into the highest echelons of French society. Moreau may have silenced Nathaniel, Genevieve said one evening, as they sat by the fire in Madame Dubois' chalet. But he hasn't silenced us. We will expose his treachery, even if it takes years. Genevieve revealed that their next target was General Beaumont, Moreau's primary patron and protector. Beaumont, a decorated war hero with immense political influence, was the key to Moreau's power. Bringing him down would be a monumental task, but the Nightingales had a plan. Beaumont has a weakness, Genevieve explained. His daughter, Isabelle. She is young, idealistic, and disillusioned with her father's politics. She could be our key. Isabelle Beaumont was known for her charitable work, her involvement with organizations that aided war veterans and their families. She was also, secretly, a sympathizer to the Nightingale cause, providing them with information and resources from within her father's inner circle. Elizabeth's new mission was to connect with Isabelle, to gain her trust, to work with her to gather evidence against Moreau and Beaumont. It was a dangerous undertaking, placing her directly in the line of fire. But Elizabeth, fueled by grief and a burning desire for justice, embraced the challenge. Using her nursing background as a cover, Elizabeth secured a position at a veterans hospital in Geneva, where Isabelle Beaumont frequently volunteered. Their first encounter was carefully orchestrated, a seemingly chance meeting during a fundraising event. "Mademoiselle Garrison, isn't it?" Isabelle said, her voice warm and friendly. "I've heard wonderful things about your work with the veterans." Elizabeth smiled, her heart pounding in her chest. "Thank you, Mademoiselle Beaumont. It's an honor to serve those who have sacrificed so much for our country." Their conversation was brief, polite, but it was a start. Elizabeth sensed a vulnerability in Isabelle, a hidden sadness that resonated with her own. She knew she had to proceed cautiously, building trust gradually, earning Isabelle's confidence. Over the next few weeks, Elizabeth and Isabelle worked together at the hospital, sharing stories, exchanging confidences. Elizabeth learned about Isabelle's strained relationship with her father, her growing disillusionment with his political machinations, her secret desire for a more just and equitable society. Isabelle, in turn, was drawn to Elizabeth's quiet strength, her compassionate nature, her unwavering commitment to helping others. She sensed a shared pain, a common bond forged in the crucible of loss and suffering. One evening, after a particularly grueling day at the hospital, Isabelle invited Elizabeth to her family's estate, a sprawling mansion overlooking Lake Geneva. It was a risky move, stepping into the lion's den, but Elizabeth knew it was an opportunity she couldn't afford to miss. The Beaumont estate was a world of opulence and privilege, a stark contrast to the humble simplicity of Madame du Bois' chalet. General Beaumont, a stern, imposing figure with a piercing gaze, greeted Elizabeth with polite suspicion. He was clearly protective of his daughter, wary of outsiders. "Mademoiselle Garrison," he said, his voice formal and aloof. "Isabelle speaks highly of you. I trust you are discreet." Elizabeth met his gaze, her own unwavering. "I am, General," she said. "I understand the importance of confidentiality." The evening was tense, filled with veiled threats and unspoken accusations. General Beaumont, sensing Elizabeth's connection to Isabelle, tried to intimidate her, to warn her off. But Elizabeth, fueled by her grief and her determination, refused to be cowed. As she was leaving, Isabelle pulled her aside, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "I know who you are," she whispered, "and I know why you're here. I want to help." Elizabeth's heart leaped with hope. She had found an ally, a partner in her quest for justice. Isabelle handed Elizabeth a small, sealed envelope. "This contains evidence," she said. "Proof of my father's corruption, of Moreau's treachery. It's not enough to bring them down, but it's a start." Elizabeth took the envelope, her fingers trembling slightly. It was a dangerous game they were playing, a dance with the devil. But they were in it together now, two women bound by a shared grief, a common purpose, a burning desire for justice. The general's daughter had become the Nightingale's newest recruit, and the stakes had just been raised. Chapter 15. Masks and Moonlight. The evidence Isabelle provided was damning, but circumstantial. It consisted of coded letters, financial records hinting at illicit transactions, and whispered testimonies from disgruntled employees within General Beaumont's vast network. It was enough to raise suspicions, but not enough to secure a conviction. They needed something more concrete, something irrefutable. Genevieve, upon reviewing the documents, devised a daring plan. "We need to get inside Moreau's office," she said. "He must have incriminating evidence hidden there, something that links him directly to Beaumont and his crimes." Moreau's office was located in a heavily guarded building in Paris, a fortress of secrecy and power. Infiltrating it would be a near impossible task. But the Nightingales had a secret weapon: Isabelle. As General Beaumont's daughter, Isabelle had access to social circles and events that were otherwise off-limits to the Nightingales. She was also, unbeknownst to her father, a skilled mimic and actress, capable of impersonating others with remarkable accuracy. The plan was audacious, bordering on reckless. Isabelle would impersonate a high-ranking government official, a woman named Madame du Bois III, and hopefully final, cruel irony of that name, who was known to have dealings with Moreau. Under this guise, she would gain access to Moreau's office, search for the incriminating evidence, and escape before her true identity was discovered. Elizabeth would accompany Isabel, posing as her assistant, providing support and cover. It was a dangerous mission, fraught with peril. Discovery meant certain imprisonment or worse. They spent weeks preparing, meticulously planning every detail, rehearsing every scenario. Isabel studied Madame Du Bois' mannerisms, her speech patterns, her personal history. Elizabeth, in turn, learned the intricacies of Moreau's office layout, the security protocols, the potential escape routes. The chosen night for the infiltration was the annual Bastille Day celebration, a grand event attended by the Parisian elite, including General Beaumont and Moreau. The city would be in a festive mood, security would be heightened but also distracted, providing a window of opportunity. Isabel, transformed by makeup and costume into a convincing replica of Madame Du Bois, was a vision of elegance and authority. Elizabeth, dressed in a simple but stylish suit, played the role of her efficient and discreet assistant. They arrived at the event, mingling with the crowd, exchanging pleasantries with government officials, military officers, and wealthy industrialists. The atmosphere was charged with excitement, the air filled with the sound of music, laughter, and the popping of champagne corks. General Beaumont, seeing his daughter, or rather, the woman he believed to be his daughter, greeted her with a mixture of pride and paternal concern. "Isabel, my dear," he said, kissing her on both cheeks. "You look radiant. But be careful. There are unsavory characters about." Isabel smiled, her heart pounding in her chest. "Don't worry, father," she said. "I can take care of myself." Moreau, standing nearby, observed the exchange with a predatory gaze. He was a handsome man, but his eyes held a cold, calculating intelligence that sent a shiver down Elizabeth's spine. "Madame Du Bois," he said, approaching Isabel with a charming smile. "It's a pleasure to see you again." Isabel, playing her role flawlessly, returned his smile. "The pleasure is all mine, Monsieur Moreau," she said. "I have some matters I wish to discuss with you, in private." Moreau's eyes flickered with interest.
"Of course," he said.
"My office is at your disposal." Under the cover of the festivities, Isabel and Elizabeth slipped away from the crowd, making their way to Moreau's office. The building was heavily guarded, but Isabel, using her assumed identity and her father's influence, managed to bypass security with ease. They entered Moreau's office, a lavishly decorated space filled with antique furniture, expensive artwork, and the unmistakable scent of power. The room was bathed in moonlight, streaming through the large windows, casting long shadows across the floor. They began their search, systematically going through drawers, cabinets, and files. Time was of the essence. They had to find the evidence and escape before their absence was noticed. As Elizabeth was searching through a locked filing cabinet, she heard a noise. A faint click coming from the doorway. She turned, her heart leaping into her throat. Moreau was standing there, his face a mask of fury, a pistol in his hand.
"Who are you?"
he demanded, his voice low and menacing. "And what are you doing here?" The masks were off. The moonlight revealed the truth. The game was up. Chapter 16. The Serpent in the Garden. Isabel, thinking quickly, stepped forward, shielding Elizabeth. "Monsieur Moreau," she said, her voice surprisingly calm, "there's been a misunderstanding. I am a representative of General Beaumont. He sent me to retrieve some sensitive documents." Moreau's eyes narrowed. He didn't believe her, not for a second. "You're lying," he said, his voice cold and hard. "You're not Madame Du Bois. And you're not working for Beaumont." He raised the pistol, pointing it directly at Isabel.
"Who are you?"
he demanded again. Isabel, realizing that her charade was over, straightened her shoulders and met his gaze. "I am Isabel Beaumont," she said, her voice ringing with defiance. "And I know all about your crimes, Moreau. Your treachery, your corruption, your betrayal of France." Moreau's face twisted in a snarl. "You foolish girl," he said. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." He took a step closer, his finger tightening on the trigger. Elizabeth, seeing that Isabel was in imminent danger, acted without thinking. She lunged at Moreau, knocking the pistol from his hand. The gun went off, the bullet shattering a nearby window, the sound echoing through the night. Moreau, enraged, turned on Elizabeth, grabbing her by the throat. "You interfering bitch," he hissed. "You'll pay for this." He began to squeeze, his grip tightening, cutting off Elizabeth's air supply. She struggled, desperately trying to break free, but he was too strong. Isabel, seeing that Elizabeth was about to be killed, grabbed a heavy bronze statue from a nearby table and smashed it over Moreau's head. He crumpled to the floor, unconscious, a pool of blood forming around his head. Isabel and Elizabeth stood there, panting, their bodies shaking with adrenaline. They had survived, but just barely. "We have to go," Isabel said, her voice urgent.
"Now."
They quickly gathered the documents they had found, stuffing them into Elizabeth's bag. They didn't know what they had, but they knew it was important. They fled the office, making their way back through the crowded ballroom, their hearts pounding in their chests. They had to get out of there, before Moreau regained consciousness, before anyone discovered what had happened. As they were nearing the exit, they ran into General Beaumont. He looked at them, his eyes filled with suspicion. "Isabel?"
he said.
"What's going on? Where have you been?" Isabel, thinking quickly, forced a smile. "Father," she said, "I was just getting some fresh air." The party was getting a bit stuffy. Beaumont didn't look convinced. He glanced at Elizabeth, his eyes narrowing. "And who is this?" he asked, his voice sharp. "I don't recognize her." Before Isabel could answer, a commotion erupted near the entrance. Moreau, his head bandaged, his face contorted with rage, was being carried out by security guards. "They attacked me," he shouted, pointing at Isabel and Elizabeth. "They're spies. Traitors. Arrest them." Beaumont's eyes widened in shock. He looked at his daughter, his face a mixture of confusion and disbelief. "Isabel?"
he said.
"What's the meaning of this?" Isabel met her father's gaze, her own filled with a mixture of sadness and defiance. "It's true, father," she said. "I am a traitor. To you, to your corrupt regime, to everything you stand for." She turned to Elizabeth. "Go," she said. "Get out of here. Save yourself." Elizabeth hesitated, reluctant to leave Isabel behind. But she knew she had to. She had the evidence, the proof of Moreau's treachery. She had to get it to safety, to expose him, to avenge Nathaniel. She squeezed Isabel's hand. "I won't forget you," she said. "I promise." Then, she turned and ran, disappearing into the night, leaving Isabel to face her father's wrath, Moreau's vengeance, the consequences of her actions. The serpent had been found in the garden, and the idyllic facade of the Beaumont estate was shattered, revealing the darkness that lay beneath. Chapter 17. Under a sky of fire. Elizabeth fled through the Parisian streets, the sounds of pursuit echoing behind her. Moreau's shouts, Beaumont's orders, the general alarm raised by the Bastille Day revelers, it all blended into a cacophony of chaos, fueling her desperate flight. She knew she couldn't return to any of her known contacts. Moreau's reach was too extensive, his network too pervasive. She headed towards the Seine, hoping to lose herself in the maze of narrow streets and alleyways that lined the river. The fireworks display, celebrating the national holiday, began overhead, painting the night sky with bursts of color and light. But for Elizabeth, the spectacle was a terrifying reminder of the war, of the explosions, the screams, the constant threat of death. She found a small, deserted boatyard, hidden beneath one of the bridges that spanned the Seine. She huddled among the overturned boats, her body shaking, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She clutched the bag containing the documents, her only lifeline, her only weapon against Moreau and Beaumont. She waited, listening for any sign of pursuit, her senses on high alert. The sounds of the city, the distant sirens, the shouts of the revelers, the rumble of traffic seemed to press in on her, amplifying her fear, her isolation. As the hours passed, the fireworks subsided, the crowds dispersed, the city slowly began to quiet down. Elizabeth, exhausted and emotionally drained, felt a glimmer of hope. She had survived the initial pursuit. She had evaded Moreau's clutches, at least for now. She knew she couldn't stay in Paris. She had to get out of the city, out of the country, as quickly as possible. She needed to find a safe haven, a place where she could regroup, analyze the documents, and plan her next move. She remembered the Nightingales' network, the contacts they had in various parts of Europe. She needed to reach them, to seek their help. As dawn broke, painting the sky with soft hues of pink and orange, Elizabeth emerged from her hiding place. She looked around, her eyes scanning the surroundings. The city was beginning to stir, the streets slowly coming to life. She saw a familiar figure standing on the bridge above her, silhouetted against the rising sun. It was Genevieve. Elizabeth's heart leaped with relief. She had been found. Genevieve, seeing Elizabeth, quickly made her way down to the boatyard. She embraced her, her eyes filled with concern. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice urgent. "We heard what happened. We've been searching for you all night." Elizabeth nodded, her voice choked with emotion.
I'm alive," she said.
"But Isabel, she's been captured." Genevieve's face hardened.
"We know," she said.
"We'll get her back. But first, we need to get you to safety." Genevieve led Elizabeth to a nearby safe house, a small, unassuming apartment hidden in a quiet neighborhood. The apartment was sparsely furnished, but it was clean and safe, a welcome refuge from the dangers of the city. "Rest," Genevieve said. "You're safe here. We'll take care of everything." Elizabeth, exhausted and emotionally drained, collapsed onto the bed, falling into a deep, troubled sleep. Her dreams were filled with images of Nathaniel, of Isabel, of Moreau, of the fiery sky above Paris. When she awoke, it was evening. Genevieve was sitting beside her, her face grim. "We have a problem," she said. "Moreau has put out a warrant for your arrest. He's accusing you of espionage, of treason, of attempted murder." Elizabeth's heart sank. She was now a fugitive, hunted by the French authorities, pursued by a ruthless enemy. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "We get you out of France," Genevieve said. "Tonight. We have a contact in Marseille, a ship captain who is willing to smuggle you to England." It was a risky plan, a desperate gamble. But it was their only chance. They left the safe house under the cover of darkness, making their way through the back streets of Paris, avoiding the main thoroughfares, the police patrols, the ever-present threat of discovery. They reached the docks, a sprawling complex of warehouses, cranes, and ships. The air was thick with the scent of salt water, diesel fuel, and the myriad smells of a busy port. Genevieve led Elizabeth to a small, nondescript freighter, its hull rusty and weathered. The captain, a gruff, taciturn man named Captain Dubois, no relation to any other, and not a spy. "This much," she checked, greeted them with a nod. "You're ready?" he asked, his voice low and gruff. Elizabeth nodded. "Yes," she said. "I'm ready." She climbed aboard the ship. Under a sky of fire, both real and imagined, the promise remained strong. Chapter 18. The Reckoning at Verdun. The voyage to England was uneventful, but the constant threat of discovery hung heavy in the air. Elizabeth spent most of the time hidden in a cramped, stuffy cabin below deck, her thoughts consumed by Nathaniel, Isabel, and the perilous mission that lay ahead. Captain Dubois, a man of few words but unwavering loyalty to the Nightingale cause, provided her with food and water and assured her of their safe passage. Upon reaching the English coast, Elizabeth was met by a contingent of British Nightingales, who whisked her away to a secluded safe house in the countryside. There, she finally had the opportunity to examine the documents she had retrieved from Moreau's office. The contents were explosive. They detailed a vast network of corruption and espionage, implicating not only Moreau and General Beaumont but also several high-ranking officials in both the French and British governments. The documents revealed a conspiracy that reached far beyond the personal vendetta against Nathaniel. It was a plot to destabilize the fragile peace, to reignite the flames of war for personal gain and political power. Elizabeth, with the help of the British Nightingales, began to meticulously analyze the documents, piecing together the intricate web of deceit and betrayal. She discovered that Nathaniel's investigation had uncovered only the tip of the iceberg. He had stumbled upon a conspiracy that threatened to plunge Europe back into chaos. Armed with this damning evidence, Elizabeth knew she had to act. She couldn't allow Moreau and his collaborators to succeed. She had to expose them, to bring them to justice, to avenge Nathaniel and Isabel, and to prevent another devastating war. She decided to return to France. It was a reckless decision, putting her directly in harm's way. But she felt she had no other choice. She had to confront Moreau, to expose his crimes to the world. Genevieve, who had arrived in England to coordinate the effort, vehemently opposed the plan. "It's too dangerous, Elizabeth," she argued. "Moreau is a powerful man. He will stop at nothing to silence you." Elizabeth, however, was resolute. "I'm not afraid of Moreau," she said. "I have the truth on my side. And I have the Nightingales behind me." With the support of both the British and French Nightingales, a daring plan was devised. They would leak the documents to the press, simultaneously in London and Paris, creating a public outcry that would force the authorities to act. They would also arrange a secret meeting with a select group of journalists and officials who were known to be sympathetic to their cause, providing them with irrefutable proof of Moreau's treachery. The chosen location for the meeting was symbolic: Verdun, the site of one of the bloodiest battles of the Great War, a place where hundreds of thousands of soldiers had lost their lives, a testament to the horrors of war and the futility of violence. Elizabeth, disguised as a journalist, traveled back to France, accompanied by a small team of Nightingales. They arrived in Verdun under the cover of darkness, making their way to a pre-arranged meeting point, a ruined church on the outskirts of the city. The church was a haunting reminder of the war's devastation, its walls scarred with bullet holes, its roof partially collapsed, its stained glass windows shattered. It was a fitting setting for the reckoning that was about to take place. The journalists and officials arrived, one by one, their faces grim, their eyes filled with a mixture of apprehension and determination. They were risking their careers, their reputations, even their lives, by attending this secret meeting. Elizabeth, stepping forward, presented the evidence, laying bare the intricate details of Moreau's conspiracy, his collaboration with General Beaumont, his betrayal of both France and England. Her voice was steady, her delivery impassioned, her words ringing with the truth. The attendees were stunned, shocked by the scale of the deception, the audacity of the plot. They listened intently, their faces growing increasingly pale, their eyes widening with disbelief and outrage. Suddenly, the church doors burst open, and a contingent of French soldiers stormed in, led by Moreau himself. He had been tipped off, alerted to their meeting. "You're all under arrest," he shouted, his voice filled with rage. "For treason, for conspiracy, for aiding and abetting a fugitive." The soldiers surrounded the group, their rifles pointed, their faces grim. Elizabeth and the Nightingales were trapped, outnumbered, outgunned. But Elizabeth, standing tall, refused to be intimidated. She looked Moreau directly in the eye, her gaze unwavering. "You may have the guns, Moreau," she said, her voice ringing with defiance. "But you don't have the truth. And the truth will prevail." A tense standoff ensued, the air thick with anticipation, the fate of everyone present hanging in the balance. The reckoning at Verdun, a symbolic battle between truth and lies, between justice and corruption, had begun. Chapter 19. A Love Forged in Flames. As Moreau's soldiers tightened their grip, a figure emerged from the shadows at the back of the ruined church. It was Nathaniel. He was alive, scarred, but undeniably alive. The sight of him sent a shockwave through the room. Elizabeth gasped, her heart leaping with a mixture of disbelief and overwhelming joy. Moreau, stunned, momentarily lost his composure. "Blackwood?" he stammered. "But you're dead. I saw to it myself." Nathaniel, his face grim, his eyes filled with a cold fury, stepped forward. "You tried, Moreau," he said, his voice resonating through the church. "But you failed. Just as you failed to silence the truth." Nathaniel's survival was a miracle, orchestrated by a faction within the French military intelligence who had long suspected Moreau's treachery. They had intercepted him after his capture at the Bellegarde station, faked his execution, and kept him hidden, waiting for the opportune moment to strike back. Isabelle's capture, though tragic, had accelerated their plans. Nathaniel, with the help of his secret allies, had been tracking Moreau's movements, gathering evidence, preparing for this final confrontation. He had known about the meeting at Verdun, had anticipated Moreau's arrival. His presence shifted the balance of power. The soldiers, many of whom had served under Nathaniel during the war, were hesitant to act against him. They knew his reputation for bravery, for integrity, for unwavering loyalty to France. Soldiers, Nathaniel commanded, his voice ringing with authority. Stand down. This man, he pointed at Moreau, is a traitor. He has betrayed our country, our people. He is the enemy, not us. A tense silence filled the church. The soldiers, caught between their orders and their conscience, wavered. Some lowered their rifles, their faces filled with doubt. Seeing his control slipping away, Moreau panicked. He grabbed a nearby soldier, using him as a human shield, and backed towards the exit. Don't try to stop me, he shouted, or I'll kill him. Nathaniel, however, remained calm. He knew Moreau was desperate, that he was capable of anything. Let him go, Moreau, Nathaniel said. It's over. You're finished. Moreau, his eyes filled with a mixture of rage and fear, hesitated. He looked around the church, at the faces of the soldiers, the journalists, the officials, the nightingales. He saw the truth reflected in their eyes. He had lost. With a final, desperate cry, he shoved the soldier aside and fled the church, disappearing into the darkness. The soldiers, released from Moreau's control, immediately turned their attention to apprehending him. A chaotic pursuit ensued, the sounds of gunfire and shouting echoing through the night. Elizabeth rushed to Nathaniel, embracing him tightly, her body shaking with relief and joy. You're alive, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. I thought I'd lost you forever. Nathaniel held her close, his arms strong and protective. I'm here, Elizabeth, he said, and I'm not going anywhere. They stood there, locked in an embrace, oblivious to the chaos around them. They had survived, against all odds. They had found each other again, amidst the ruins of war and the wreckage of betrayal. In the aftermath of the confrontation, Moreau was eventually captured, his conspiracy exposed, his power shattered. General Beaumont, implicated in Moreau's crimes, was arrested and stripped of his rank and honors. Isabelle, though initially imprisoned, was eventually released, her actions recognized as a courageous attempt to expose corruption and injustice. The documents Elizabeth had retrieved from Moreau's office, along with Nathaniel's testimony, provided irrefutable proof of the conspiracy. The scandal rocked both the French and British governments, leading to widespread reforms and a renewed commitment to peace and transparency. Elizabeth and Nathaniel, their love forged in the flames of war and tempered by the trials of betrayal and sacrifice, finally found their peace. They had faced death, danger, and despair, but they had emerged stronger, their bond unbreakable. The reckoning at Verdun had not only brought justice to the guilty, but had also reunited two hearts, proving that even in the darkest of times, love could prevail. Chapter 20. Dawn over the Seine. With Moreau and his network dismantled and the truth brought to light, Elizabeth and Nathaniel finally had the chance to rebuild their lives. They chose to settle in Paris, the city that had witnessed both their greatest trials and their most profound connection. They found a small apartment overlooking the Seine, not far from where Elizabeth had first received the mysterious message that had set their perilous journey in motion. The scars of war, both visible and invisible, remained. Nathaniel still carried the physical wounds of his capture and torture, and the emotional trauma of his experiences lingered. Elizabeth, too, bore the weight of grief and loss, the memories of their separation, the constant fear for their lives. But together, they found solace and healing. They spent their days exploring the city, rediscovering its beauty, its charm, its vibrant spirit. They walked hand in hand along the Seine, watching the boats glide by, the sunlight shimmering on the water. They visited museums, art galleries, and historical sites, immersing themselves in the rich culture and history of France. They also continued to work with the Nightingales, supporting their ongoing efforts to promote justice, equality, and peace. They helped to establish a foundation for war veterans, providing them with medical care, financial assistance, and emotional support. They became advocates for truth and transparency, speaking out against corruption and injustice wherever they found it. Isabelle Beaumont, having reconciled with her past and embraced her role in exposing her father's crimes, became a close friend and ally. She joined them in their work, dedicating her life to helping others, to building a better future for France. One spring morning, as they were walking along the Seine, Elizabeth and Nathaniel paused on a bridge, gazing at the cityscape before them. The sun was rising, casting a golden glow over the buildings, the river, the sky. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Elizabeth said, her voice filled with a sense of peace and contentment. Nathaniel nodded, his arm around her waist.
"It is," he said.
"But not as beautiful as you." He turned to her, his eyes filled with a love that had endured the test of time, the trials of war, the darkness of betrayal. He gently brushed a strand of hair from her forehead, his fingers tracing the contours of her face. "I almost lost you," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "So many times." Elizabeth leaned into him, her head resting against his shoulder.
"But you didn't," she said.
"We found each other again, and we'll never be apart again." Nathaniel kissed her then, a long, tender kiss that sealed their love, their commitment, their future together. It was a kiss that spoke of forgiveness, of healing, of hope. It was a kiss that celebrated their resilience, their courage, their unwavering belief in the power of love. As they stood there, embraced on the bridge, the dawn breaking over the Seine, they knew that their journey had been long and arduous, filled with pain and loss, but it had also been a journey of transformation, of growth, of profound love. They had faced the darkness and emerged into the light. They had found their peace, their happiness, their forever. They had proven that even in the aftermath of war, amidst the ruins of betrayal, love could blossom, hope could endure, and a new dawn could break. The Seine flowed beneath them, a constant, ever-changing river, a symbol of life's journey, carrying them forward towards a future filled with promise, with love, with unwavering hope. Epilogue. Years passed, flowing like the Seine itself, carrying Elizabeth and Nathaniel through the gentle currents of time. Their life in Paris settled into a comfortable rhythm, a tapestry woven with threads of love, companionship, and a shared commitment to making the world a better place. The apartment overlooking the river became a haven, filled with laughter, shared meals, and quiet evenings spent reading by the fire. The walls were adorned with photographs, mementos of their journey, reminders of the battles they had fought, the love they had found, the peace they had earned. Nathaniel, though forever marked by the war, found a new purpose in writing. He penned his memoirs, chronicling his experiences, exposing the horrors of conflict, advocating for peace and reconciliation. His books became widely acclaimed, translated into numerous languages, touching the hearts and minds of readers around the world. Elizabeth continued her work with the Nightingales, expanding their network, supporting their efforts to promote justice and equality. She became a mentor to younger women, sharing her wisdom, her courage, her unwavering belief in the power of hope. Isabelle Beaumont, having served her time and atoned for her family's sins, became a prominent advocate for social reform, dedicating her life to helping the marginalized and the oppressed. She remained a close friend to Elizabeth and Nathaniel, a constant reminder of the bonds forged in the crucible of their shared struggle. The photograph, the one Elizabeth had taken of Nathaniel during the war, still held its place of honor on their nightstand. It was a reminder of their beginnings, of the spark that had ignited their love amidst the chaos and despair. But now, when Elizabeth looked at it, she no longer saw a shift in his gaze, a message from beyond. She saw the man she loved, the man who had stood by her side, the man who had shared her journey, the man who had become her world. One evening, as they were sitting on their balcony, watching the sunset paint the sky with vibrant hues of orange and purple, Nathaniel took Elizabeth's hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. "Do you remember that night in Paris?" he asked, his voice soft and filled with a hint of nostalgia. "The night you received the message, the night everything changed?" Elizabeth nodded, her heart filled with a bittersweet mix of memories. "How could I forget?" she said. "It was the beginning of our adventure." Nathaniel smiled, his eyes reflecting the golden light of the setting sun. "An adventure that led us through darkness and despair," he said. "But also, an adventure that led us to each other." Elizabeth leaned her head against his shoulder, her body nestled close to his. "I wouldn't trade it for anything," she said. "Even the pain, even the fear, even the loss. It all brought us here, to this moment." Nathaniel kissed her forehead, his lips lingering on her skin. "We were meant to be, Elizabeth," he said. "From the moment we met, in that makeshift hospital tent, amidst the chaos of war, I knew." Elizabeth looked up at him, her eyes shining with a love that had deepened and matured over the years. "Me too, Nathaniel," she said. "Me too." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a final, glorious ray of light across the Seine, they sat there, in silence, their hearts filled with gratitude, with peace, with a love that had conquered all. Their journey had been long and arduous, but it had led them home, to each other, to a future filled with hope, with promise, with the unwavering certainty that they would always be together. The river flowed on, a timeless witness to their enduring love, a love forged in flames, and destined to last forever.